As the third Academy Award winner for Best Picture of 1930, All Quiet on the Western Front is often referred to as the earliest film to win the award that is truly deserving of it, as it continues to be revered to this day. It also won Best Director for Lewis Milestone, while nominated for Best Writing and Best Cinematography. Based on the famous German novel of the same name, it tells the story of a young man named Paul Bromer, played by Lou Ayres, who goes off to enlist into the German army along with his fellow classmates to fight for their fatherland at the start of the Great War, which we now know as World War I. Full of patriotic fervor and excited by the chance of personal glory, Paul and his friends quickly become disillusioned by the brutal reality of war, dealing with the physical and psychological consequences that will ultimately destroy them, even if they manage to survive it. I actually have read the original book way back when I was in high school, but unfortunately I cannot say what I really thought about it, as I've mostly forgotten it. As for my first time viewing this, it was years after I graduated from said high school, and I was already enlisted into the Air Force when I heard so much of how good this movie is, and the fact that it won Best Picture made it a priority for me to see it. By the end, I felt pretty disappointed by it. Maybe I wasn't used to how films were made from this time period, but the one thing that left a bad taste in my mouth was his very blatant anti-war message, especially at the end and how preachy it comes off as. Not that I mind the overall theme, of course war is terrible, but because of how it handled its subject with hardly any subtlety, it sullied my opinion so much that I often rank this far at the bottom of the list of films that won Best Picture. Now, fast forward several years later, having left the Air Force and went into college while becoming more acquainted and open-minded with films from this era, I decided to go back to this for a possible second opinion. Boy, have they changed dramatically! Instead of finding this a little boring and preachy, I found myself riveted with his story with a cast of likable characters as well as the amazing look of the whole thing. Yeah, I still find the anti-war message a little hokey, all thanks to the rather histrionic performance of Ayres in some points of the film, but I do get where it's coming from, and I don't find it as in your face with the overall thing. It does have a well-meaning message about war itself and how it can have adverse effects on a person. But it also makes a very interesting commentary about how war is often seen through rose-colored lens by the people who will never get the chance to experience it firsthand because of their position and power. Paul starts off as a young man, practically a teenager still in school, who gets patriotically stirred by his own schoolmaster who talks of glory at a time of Germany's entry into the war that is sweeping across Europe, filling a classroom full of vigorous young men with fantasies of personal glory and a romantic sense of adventure that war often comes with into their minds. While it is understandable for them to want to enlist into the army if to serve their country at her most dire need, but to go into war as if it is something glorious is almost baffling, to say the least. Nonetheless, it wouldn't be long until they get their first taste of it, being sent out to the front where reality finally sets in. They quickly learn that there's hardly any food to pass around, and they have to sleep in terrible and unsanitary conditions. And we haven't even seen the war itself yet, but when we do, this film does a hell of a job of never leaving things to the imagination. I have read that Steven Spielberg was inspired by this when making Saving Private Ryan, and I can definitely see the connection. For a film made in the early 1930s, it can be surprisingly graphic at points, hardly shy in showing the brutalities of war, but it still looks amazing. It's so raw and dirty that I could practically smell it, whether in the trenches or out in the battlefield, and the chaotic nature is beautifully rendered onto film thanks to the cinematography, the editing, and especially the sound. They made sure that the sound plays just as big of a role as the actors themselves, and for the technology to be introduced just a few years prior, this helps complete the immersive experience. The most distinctive sound is the whistling that signifies a bomb falling after being released from an airplane, unseen to anybody, not even the audience, making it a terrifying 5-second experience as no one would know where it will land. For a film that wants to bring the horrors of war to the general audience, this does an excellent job of putting people front and center to it all. The performance by Ayres as Paul, as I've said before, can come off as rather theatric, which I can't really blame him as that's usually the norm for films in this time period, and he is pretty young. But I still cannot help myself in finding his emotional outbursts as exaggerating at certain points. His speech at the end where he confronts his schoolmaster about the true nature of war, while purposeful, comes off as I'll let him speak for himself.
Years we've had of it. 4 years. And every day a year, and every night a century. And our bodies are earth, and our thoughts are clay, and we sleep and eat with death. And we're done for because you can't live that way and keep anything inside you.
It's far from bad, but it can't get in the way of my total enjoyment. On the other hand, Louis Wollheim as Cat gives an Oscar-worthy performance. Belligerent, he does have a heart of gold as he takes the new recruits under his wings, especially of Paul, in which the two manage to form a friendship that becomes the emotional center of this film. As a product of the war, he does carry a dark sense of humor that makes him a very entertaining character to watch, but he never comes off as insensitive. I enjoy his presence so much that if he had been the real focus, I would have liked this film even more so than I do now. For a nearly 90-year-old war film, it still holds up surprisingly well, and I can rank this as one of the best in this genre, both in the story and the technical aspects. Sure, I find it a little dated, but it never fell on its face because the heart is there. It's a strong enough film that I'll give this a 4.5 out of 5, and just how much it really deserves that Oscar. In the end, it may not become one of my absolute favorites, but if I have to make a vote, I can cast one in its favor if nothing better comes along, and it would be tough to top this one. It still retains some of that power, and even if we as a society have come to an understanding about war as being a terrible thing, it is still worth a watch because it is such a good movie and deserves to be seen.